Cobra Kokuryuuou no Densetsu is a game that changed the entire direction of the PC Engine. We're not going to see the consequences of it for a few years still. A huge portion of the CD-ROM library on the PC Engine owes an enormous debt to Cobra. The way that this game came about is weird. This is the 4th CD-ROM game released, and it's coming 3 months after the previous CD-ROM. Hudson had a very different CD-ROM game planned for release in March. But when January rolled around, it was clear that the game would need a few more months of development. Well, what do you do then? You can't be selling a 60,000 yen system and then not release games for it for 6 months. And so Hudson made a plan. They took the staff that had just completed Noriko, the launch game for the CD-ROM system. That was a very basic adventure game that had you on a date with a pop star. And fortunately, they already had the license to make a game based on Cobra, and they told them to go hog wild. It went from initial concept to being on store shelves in under 90 days. Game development was fast in the 80s, but that is still absurdly fast. Especially when working with new technology like the CD-ROM. The game is based on Cobra, sometimes known as Space Adventure Cobra in the US. Cobra started out as a comic in the late 70s, and then got a very popular animated series in the early 80s. It's about a space pirate who has all sorts of roguish adventures, wandering the universe with his android sidekick Lady. His left arm has been replaced with the Psycho Gun, a super weapon that does whatever the plot requires it to. Cobra's in the style of James Bond, where adventure will take him to some new exotic location, where he'll encounter a bunch of beautiful, mostly naked women, fight some ugly villains, and then head off to his next adventure. Cobra's one of those franchises that's a bit of a Rosetta Stone for a lot of Japanese media in the 1980s. If it's sci-fi in Japan in that period, it's likely either a reaction to, an extension of, or a quick copy of Cobra. Something that a Cobra fan might notice as a consequence of the rushed development is that they couldn't get Cobra's voice actor. There was a scheduling conflict, so rather than Nozawa Nachi's iconic voice, they got the next best thing, Yasuo Yamada, who's best known for playing Lupin. While I've seen Japanese players joke about the substitution, people also seem to be pretty happy since that's a good second choice. Cobra Kokuryuuou no Densetsu is the first digital comic on the PC Engine. Digital comic is a term that comes into use about a year after this, but it's all for the same style of game as Cobra, so it gets retroactively included. Basically, it's a type of low-difficulty, multimedia adventure games based on some media property. What little adventure game elements exist are mainly there to have you push a button and advance the story. The real selling point is the license. You're getting a new adventure of your favorite hero, complete with acted cutscenes. This becomes a relatively popular genre on the PC Engine, particularly later on in its life. Without doing a deep survey, I could spot around 24 of these games in the library, and those were just the ones that I knew. So why did the PC Engine, and the CD-ROM add-on in particular, become such a haven for these adventure games? Well, it's all about the storage space. The bitmapped graphics that they used on these 8-bit systems were not really small, or at least not small in comparison to the entire game. The cartridge might only be able to hold only 24 pictures of characters and locations before you started having to expand that ROM and up the manufacturing costs. It's one of the reasons why adventure games on consoles in the 1980s were so short. The CD-ROM eliminated that. You didn't have to keep all your pictures in a few dozen kilobytes. Now you had hundreds of megabytes. Yeah, you're giving some of that over to music tracks and voice-acted cutscenes, but there was still more space on that CD than a cartridge game could ever dream of. The limitation was no longer storage space and manufacturing budget, it was artist salaries and time. That shift is reflected in Cobra Kokuryuuou no Densetsu, where the game is broken up into 5 or 6 significant sections, and it took me an hour to get through the first one while I was following a walkthrough. This isn't a complicated game. Even more than most adventure games, you just pick menu options until the game advances, but it is a very long one. The plot is very loosely adapted from one of the major arcs in the Cobra comic, the one that happened to follow up the animated series. But rather than follow the plot of that story tightly, Hudson pulled in all of the fan-favorite characters across the entire series and just dropped them in. The plot involves Cobra hanging out in a luxury cruise liner, all part of a plot to steal some goods. But his getaway is halted when the ship is devoured by a huge space monster. That space monster isn't the Black Dragon King of the title. That villain is a warlord who lives in a city that's inside the space monster. Yet there's a lot going on in this game. I didn't even get into the parasitic hair monster, or the demon cult, who have an entirely different kind of possession than taking over people's hair. There's a reason that this adventure game is 5 or 6 hours long. The way that the gameplay works is it's a standard menu-driven adventure game. You pick your verb from the right-hand side, then pick the noun that you're going to do it to, and watch the results. 90% of the time, you're going to either look, search, or talk. And the menu cuts out any extraneous verbs, so your options at any given point are very limited. Basically, you're wandering around looking for the event that triggers the next advancement in the story. There is a bit of the old adventure game standby of selecting the same option over and over again until you've got the result you want, but that doesn't happen especially often. Of course, there's only one reason that someone would want to play Cobra Kokuryuuou no Densetsu, and that's because they like Cobra. So how well does this game fulfill that promise? The consensus I've seen among Japanese players is that it does. Adventure game fans find it to be too easy, but fans of Cobra seem to be very happy. And from my perspective, as someone who only has a little bit of experience with Cobra, I feel like this captures the tone pretty well, but I'm not really sure it's an engaging game, and I definitely wouldn't consider it to be an entry point for the property. The whole series is up on YouTube, officially, complete with English translations. Go watch that. It's a wild show, and then if you like it, then maybe give the game a try.